Camp Alice, Oahu, Territory of Hawaii, November 14th, 1945. The air was heavy, smelling of damp soil and the sharp, disinfectant-like scent of new lumber. Through the wire mesh, Private First Class Miller sat on an upturned crate, his rifle resting on his knees. A brightly colored magazine spread open. The sound of his steady breathing and the occasional snap of the paper were the only things breaking the silence. "Do not look at the sun, Miss Akemi. It will blind you," Miller said, his voice quiet but clear. His tone was not a threat, but a flat warning, a strange blend of military discipline and casual concern that violated everything Akemi had been taught about the enemy. Beside her, little Haruko, barely 15, flinched, clutching Akemi's skirt. Akemi stepped slightly forward, shielding the girl's thin frame with her own. A freshly painted sign near the gate, bearing rules in both English and block Japanese characters, explicitly stated no physical contact between personnel and detainees. It was a visible no-harm ritual, an odd reassurance in this makeshift world. Miller closed the magazine with a gentle slap. "We're just getting you home, ma'am. That's all." If you've found value in examining these overlooked narratives of the Pacific War, please consider subscribing and commenting with a war-era artifact from your home country. 4 weeks earlier, Tinian Island, Northern Mariana Islands. The air on Tinian, even weeks after the main assault, still carried the sharp, metallic odor of explosives mixed with the rot of tropical vegetation. For Akemi, the stench of defeat was worse than any physical smell. She clutched the arm of Haruko, a girl barely 15, as they were marched into the hastily constructed enclosure near the northern sector. Akemi had rehearsed the appropriate responses in her mind. Silence, defiance, the calm acceptance of a fate dictated by barbarians. She expected to see the savage, underfed faces of men crazed by lust and destruction, as portrayed in the propaganda flyers she'd helped distribute. Instead, the only man who met her eyes was a young private first class of the U.S. Army, sitting on an overturned supply crate, his rifle resting on his knees. He was tall, incredibly so, and his uniform, though dusty, was not tattered. The most unsettling thing was the sheer health radiating from him. Unlike the hollow-cheeked, sickly appearance of the last Imperial troops she had seen, this man possessed a startling, almost obscene fullness to his face and limbs. His skin was clean, his hair neatly trimmed. Akemi, along with the other women, could not look away. It was a physical, almost biological shock. This was the enemy, and he looked like he was winning the war by simply being well-fed. The enclosure itself was another contradiction. The wire mesh was new, strung taut and high, but the ground was raked smooth, and the latrines, while primitive, were clearly delineated and clean. A Marine officer, stern but not angry, read a short list of rules in surprisingly clear, albeit heavily accented, Japanese. The rules focused on sanitation, boundaries, and a promise of regular rations. No mention of violence, only procedure. The initial fear began to twist into something more complex. Confusion. As the sun began to dip, painting the clouds in hues of desperate orange and pink, the guard, Private Miller, shifted. He took out a small, rolled-up object from his breast pocket. Akemi watched, her entire being focused on the object, expecting perhaps a Bible or a military manual. It was neither. He unrolled it carefully, flattening the glossy pages of a magazine. The cover was an explosion of color, a cheerful scene, perhaps an advertisement for soda or a smiling American family. Miller settled back, his gaze on the page, the rifle forgotten for a moment. He was reading for pleasure. That image, a soldier of the conquering force, relaxed enough to read a colorful, utterly civilian magazine while guarding his defeated enemies, was the first devastating blow to Akimi's worldview. It spoke not of savagery, but of an unimaginable affluence and sense of security. They were handed thin but clean, crisp blankets for the night. Akemi wrapped Haruko tightly, but her eyes kept drifting back to the wire, to the guard, to the brightly colored paper in his hands. The gaze was no longer just fear. It was the birth of an unbearable, uncontrollable envy. The morning brought an uneasy calm. The visceral fear of immediate assault had receded, replaced by a gnawing hunger and an acute, collective awareness of the guards. Akemi didn't search for signs of brutality anymore. Instead, her eyes, and the eyes of every woman clustered near the wire, were drawn to the opposite, the absence of suffering, the evidence of plenty. She looked for the promised signs of American spiritual decay or deprivation, but all she found was routine and quiet competence. The guards changed shifts with minimal fuss, their movements economical and disciplined. They didn't shout. They didn't even meet the detainees' eyes unless absolutely necessary, which to Akemi was a form of supreme indifference, or perhaps superior restraint. This measured pace of life was the most profound cultural shock. Akemi remembered the feverish, desperate energy of the last remaining Japanese troops, fueled by a thin broth of rice and raw ideology. Here, the enemy seemed fueled by milk and steak, resting their strength. The shift change brought Private Miller back to the post. He carried his weight with a strange, lazy confidence. He was, Akemi noted with deepening unease, simply too secure to be an object of pity or contempt. He was a man who belonged to a functioning system, one that ensured his comfort even on a small, contested island. In the mid-afternoon heat, Miller sat on his crate. He reached into his pocket and retrieved the tightly rolled paper from the night before. As he unrolled it, Akemi felt the collective gaze of the women tighten around the object. The paper was stiff, glossy, and impossibly colorful. It was a magazine, its cover ablaze with vivid, cheerful colors, perhaps a depiction of a large, smiling family gathered around a ridiculously enormous roast. The act itself, a soldier taking time to enjoy a frivolous, non-military magazine while on duty, was an unimaginable luxury. It spoke of a supply chain so robust that even entertainment was expendable, and yet readily available, and a personal sense of safety so deep it allowed for mental wandering. It refuted, in a single, glossy image, years of propaganda that had described Americans as spiritually impoverished, mechanical warmongers. The other women began to whisper, a low, constant hum near the wire. Look at the colors. It is about cinema, I think. They have time for this nonsense. The magazine became a weapon of soft power, silently asserting the material and cultural superiority of the United States. When Miller turned a page, a full-page advertisement, maybe for a refrigerator or a washing machine, dominated the view. To Akemi, whose world had shrunk to the necessities of survival, the effortless depiction of such domestic abundance was a deep humiliation. It meant the enemy wasn't just better at war. They were better at life. Her gaze, and that of the group, was no longer controlled by fear, but by an aching, almost shameful fascination. This silent gazing was an act of involuntary conversion, forcing them to confront the possibility that their enemies were not only men, but men who enjoyed a peace and prosperity they themselves had never known, even before the war. Akemi had spent the better part of the morning searching for the evidence of cultural degeneracy she'd been promised. She looked for loud vulgarity, for unchecked cruelty, for the slovenliness that was supposedly inherent to the American character. But the camp was run with an unnerving, almost bureaucratic efficiency. Food rations were delivered on time. The latrines, while crude, were routinely serviced. This relentless orderliness was far more disorienting than chaos would have been. Her attention fixed on the rotating pair of guards, Miller and another younger man, whom they nicknamed the Runner for his habit of pacing. The Runner was on duty now. He rarely spoke, but his physical presence was a constant, undeniable rebuke to the propaganda. He was as tall and well-formed as Miller, and his uniform, though creased and dusty from the Pacific climate, seemed to repel dirt. This was the core of the dilemma. The enemy was clean. Akemi remembered the last Japanese soldiers who had passed through her village, emaciated, their uniforms patched with mud and blood, their exposed skin scarred and often septic. Their bodies had borne the physical weight of the war's slow defeat. In stark contrast, the Runner's skin looked healthy, his fingernails neatly trimmed, and his posture, even when leaning against the wire, suggested a deep-seated physical well-being. It was an appalling display of material superiority. The crucial moment arrived when the Runner's relief arrived. Before handing over his post, the guard unbuckled his heavy canvas and leather boots. Akemi watched, fascinated and horrified, as he did not simply shake the dirt off or discard them in a corner, but took out a small, well-worn brush and began to methodically clean the dirt from the seams and eyelets. The sharp, clean smell of leather and boot polish, faint on the breeze, cut through the tropical humidity. This small, private ritual of maintenance spoke volumes. It was an act of respect for an inanimate object of war, a sign that such items were not disposable. It implied that this soldier existed within a system that valued and supplied such care. Akemi felt a bitter surge of shame. She remembered the near-religious importance placed on gamin, endurance, in their own training, which often translated into a purposeful neglect of self and comfort as a sign of spiritual strength. But now, seeing the Runner's clean, gleaming boots beside her own soiled, broken footwear, she felt a terrible doubt rise. Had their endurance merely been a mask for logistical failure? Was the enemy's discipline, the cleanliness, the routine maintenance, actually the superior form of strength? She lowered her eyes, shielding Haruko from the painful, constant observation. The truth was beginning to form. She wasn't gazing at a monster. She was gazing at a man who was clearly connected to a prosperous, well-ordered world. And that prosperity, she realized, was more frightening than any individual act of cruelty. The knowledge gained from observing the guards' magazines and their general deportment quickly morphed into a need for verification. Akemi and the others felt compelled to test the limits of this strange, nonviolent captivity. If the Americans were not monsters, were they simply cold machines, strictly following a Geneva Convention mandate? The camp's central security feature was the formidable wire mesh fence, not electrified, but tall and imposing, clearly defining the line between detainee and captor. Akemi, driven by a quiet urgency, began to walk slowly near this perimeter, occasionally stopping to examine a stone or point out a lizard to Haruko, thus creeping closer to Private Miller's post. It was a calculated risk. A single moment of American impatience or anger would validate every warning she had been given. Miller watched her. His gaze was steady, impartial, but never threatening. He shifted his stance, resting his weight first on one leg, then the other, but he did not raise his rifle, nor did he issue a verbal warning. The visible, freshly painted sign near the gate clearly displayed the regulation. Keep a minimum distance of 10 feet from the barrier. The tension peaked when Mrs. Chio, the older woman who had commented on the magazine, suffered a sudden, hacking cough that echoed loudly in the afternoon silence. She stumbled, leaning heavily against the wire for support. Akemi immediately rushed to steady her, bracing herself for the inevitable, harsh reaction. A yell, a gun butt pressed against the wire. something aggressive to enforce the rule. Instead, Miller immediately stood up straight, his hands instinctively going to the rifle, but he did not step forward. He maintained his distance, pointing quickly and deliberately at the large institutional sign that read, "No contact." It was a pure act of enforcement, not personal malice. Then came the true turning point. Miller lowered his hand, and without taking his eyes off them, turned his head slightly and called out in English. Moments later, a woman in a clean white nurse's uniform, an American Army nurse, appeared, carrying a medical bag. Miller simply pointed toward Mrs. Chio and stepped 2 full paces back from his original position, emphasizing the spatial boundary. Akemi observed the paradox. The guard would not break the security protocol to offer comfort, but his role included summoning aid. It was a powerful lesson in American pragmatism. Safety and procedure were paramount, but cruelty was not part of the standard operating procedure. Akemi helped Mrs. Chio move away from the wire mesh fence as the nurse approached on the outside of the barrier. The fence was the absolute limit for the guard, but it was porous to humanity. Akemi's fear began its final descent into intellectual resignation. The safety of their bodies was guaranteed not by the moral benevolence of the individual soldier, but by the cold, effective rules of the occupying power. This was far more unnerving than dealing with a simple brute. The constant sight of the magazine had transformed it from a mere object into a symbol, a brightly colored window into the unimaginable world of the enemy. Akemi's desperate need to understand the men guarding them superseded her fear. She knew the pages held keys to their culture, their desires, their definition of normalcy. Private Miller was aware of their intense scrutiny. He no longer held the magazine quite so carelessly. Sometimes he would read with the cover turned inward, a subtle act of denying them the visual candy. Yet at other times, he seemed to forget their presence entirely, absorbed in the glossy pages, betraying his deep immersion in his own world. The conflict was now purely one of proximity and information. Akemi would move close to the wire mesh fence, pretending to tend to the meager patch of weeds the women had been given permission to clear. She strained to catch a glimpse of text, anything beyond the loud, garish advertisements. The distant scent of fresh ink and slick paper was tantalizingly out of reach, a luxurious smell completely unlike the damp, salty air of the island. The accidental breakthrough happened during a particularly strong gust of wind that whipped through the camp. Miller, caught off guard, fumbled. The magazine slipped from his grip and fell open, its spine cracking sharply as it landed face up in the dirt, though he quickly snatched it back. In that brief, suspended moment, Akemi saw it. It wasn't an ad for soap or a cartoon drawing. It was a dense block of text accompanying a small, grainy photograph of an ordinary suburban street, or perhaps a serious-looking, middle-aged man. It was an editorial, a piece of serious opinion, likely discussing the future of the war, the demands of peace, or the economic impact on the home front. The image, fleetingly glimpsed, showed an average American citizen, and the serious text suggested the guard was engaging with ideas, not just escaping into fantasy. The sight shattered the remaining vestiges of the soulless automaton myth. Akemi had been trained to believe the enemy was a single, monolithic, brutal entity. Yet, here was evidence of internal debate, domestic concerns, and intellectual engagement. A complex society of people with opinions and private lives that continued, uninterrupted by the brutality of the front lines. Akemi's initial awe now deepened into a sorrowful recognition. The men behind the wire had families, opinions, and a vibrant public sphere that survived the war intact. They were whole people. The gaze, which had begun as fear, had fully transitioned into a yearning for a world where one could worry about editorial opinions rather than starvation. When Miller finally secured the magazine, his face unreadable, Akemi knew the transfer of power, the soft, cultural power, was complete. She would have to learn to navigate this new truth. The Sundays in the Tinian camp were marked by a profound, if strange, quietness. The usual military noise, the rumble of trucks, the distant shouting of orders, subsided, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Akemi watched the American compound, searching for a pattern, a recurring event that might explain their disciplined yet relaxed demeanor. She found it across the road, near a large tent that served as a makeshift chapel. On this particular Sunday morning, a group of American soldiers, dressed in their cleanest uniforms, gathered. They were not engaged in drilling or cleaning weapons. They were participating in a ritual. A chaplain, recognizable by the cross on his uniform collar, stood before them. The scene felt profoundly out of place amidst the remnants of battle. The soft conflict for Akemi was observing this display of organized piety. Propaganda had painted the enemy as materialistic and godless, concerned only with technological supremacy. Yet here they were, pausing the grim business of war to address a spiritual need. Akemi and the other women watched the proceedings in silence, a shared, silent recognition of a deeply rooted cultural practice they had been taught to scorn. The turning point came when the group began to sing. Their voices, predominantly deep and untrained, rose and fell in unison. It wasn't the martial rhythm of war songs, nor the swinging jazz that sometimes drifted from the barracks. It was a slow, measured melody, a hymn, solemn and comforting. The sound carried across the short distance, a low, melodic contrast to the harsh environment. Source cue. The presence of chaplains and mandatory or encouraged religious services was a sustained feature in the U.S. military during the war. Simultaneously, the air shifted, carrying the rich, warm scent of brewed coffee and toasted bread, evidence of a special Sunday meal. The sensory details were overwhelming. The quiet dignity of their worship, combined with the luxury of a warm, fragrant breakfast. Akemi remembered the meager, rice-based offerings and the rushed, whispered prayers of devotion at the temporary shrines back home, built from rough-hewn planks. The realization struck her with an emotional force greater than the sight of the magazine. The enemy possessed not only material wealth, but also a spiritual foundation robust enough to maintain these rituals in a combat zone. Their faith, whatever its form, was integrated into their strength. Akemi closed her eyes momentarily, a sudden acute memory of her own family's small Buddhist temple flashing through her mind. She felt a profound sense of cultural loss, not that their culture was inferior, but that it had been so completely decimated by the war's desperate conditions. The admiration that had begun as envy of American material possessions now transitioned into a curious, cautious respect for their spiritual coherence. She started to understand that their victory was built on a foundation far deeper than bombs and steel. The silent observation had become Akemi's new form of survival. After the revelation of the Sunday ritual, she no longer sought out acts of kindness, but rather consistency, the unwavering rhythm of the enemy's routine. She knew that Private Miller, or whichever guard was posted, would adhere to the letter of the rules, but her curiosity now lay in the small, personal behaviors that lay outside those military mandates. She often wondered if Miller was aware of the intense focus the women maintained on him, on the magazine, on every gesture he made. Sometimes, she thought she detected a slight stiffness, a deliberate avoidance of looking their way, suggesting he did know he was being studied like a specimen. She desperately wanted to breach the wall of silence to convey a question, not about her immediate safety, but about the world outside that glossy paper. The crucial observation occurred near the end of Miller's shift. The sun was beginning its slow arc toward the Pacific horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty compound. Miller finished the page he was reading. He did not simply toss the magazine onto the ground or leave it lying open on his crate, as Akemi might have expected a soldier in a temporary camp to do. Instead, with a quiet, deliberate economy of movement, Miller began to roll the magazine up, carefully smoothing out the inevitable wrinkles in the pages. His fingers worked with an almost tender reverence, folding the paper precisely before tucking the tight cylinder into the secure breast pocket of his uniform. This meticulous act of preservation of a cheap, replaceable item of entertainment spoke volumes. The sound of his relief detail approaching, the measured tramp of boots and the low murmur of voices came moments later, a backdrop to this intimate, careful closure. Akemi realized that this meticulousness was not just a military habit. It was a symptom of a culture where objects were valued and maintained because they were part of a life of plenty. They had enough, not just to read for pleasure, but to preserve that pleasure for the next shift, the next day. Akemi remembered how her people had been forced to burn books and paper for warmth during the final, desperate days of the campaign, how everything had become disposable for the sake of survival. Miller's careful act of folding the magazine demonstrated a profound difference in their scales of value. It was not mere discipline. It was the soft luxury of a culture that could afford respect for its own material comfort. The guard was signaling, without a word, that his life, his property, and by extension, their safety, were considered worthy of careful maintenance. The recognition that the enemy cherished a cheap, colorful piece of print finalized Akemi's transformation. The enemy was not a beast of burden, but a creature of conscious value. The accumulated weight of the clean boots, the disciplined routine, the smell of coffee, and the vivid colors of the magazine finally broke the mental framework Akemi had been forced to inhabit. The realization was no longer an intellectual curiosity, but a profound and painful resignation. The Japanese Empire had lost the war not just on the battlefield, but in the domain of culture and logistics. Akemi sat near the fence, observing Private Miller, who was now reading his magazine without even glancing toward the detainees. He was so completely absorbed in his own world of sports scores or celebrity gossip that the women in the cage felt ironically safe, but also deeply irrelevant. The propaganda had been a lie. The enemy was not desperate, savage, or lacking in culture. They were, in fact, incredibly comfortable and casually civilized, even while maintaining a temporary detention camp on a conquered island. The turning point was voiced by another woman, Kiko, a former telephone operator who suddenly stood up and stared fiercely at the glossy paper in Miller's hands. "They told us lies," Kiko announced loudly in Japanese, her voice trembling not with fear, but with sudden, devastating clarity. "They told us the Americans were beasts of labor, that their prosperity was a trick of the West. But look at him. He has enough peace in his heart to read about baseball while he watches us starve." Akemi did not argue. She merely nodded, the action small but monumental. The acknowledgement meant relinquishing everything she had been taught about honor, superiority, and inevitable victory. The guilt of surviving now mingled with the guilt of betraying a collapsed ideology. The sun began its spectacular daily surrender into the Pacific, painting the camp in hues of burnt orange and deep violet. Miller finally stood up to stretch, leaving the folded magazine briefly on his empty crate. In the fading light, the pages shimmered. It no longer looked like a mocking symbol of unreachable wealth, but rather a promise, a testament to a different kind of life. This was the nature of the enemy's true victory: soft power. The enemy's strength was not just in their tanks, but in their ability to maintain their cultural norms, their leisure, and their comfort even in the midst of total war. They fought not as desperate men, but as men defending a high standard of living. This silent, constant display of unruffled affluence was a force far more potent than any bayonet. Akemi understood that to survive this defeat, she would need to learn not how to hate this enemy, but how to understand the world that produced them. Her gaze was no longer hostile. It was pragmatic, hungry for knowledge. The resignation that settled over Akemi was not passive. It was the quiet determination of a student studying a powerful, complex subject. She had accepted that the enemy was human, but she still needed to know if the individual man, Private Miller, could recognize her humanity across the forbidden zone of the wire mesh fence. The language barrier was absolute, and the posted rules strictly forbade any exchange of objects or direct conversation. Akemi chose the medium of the ground. While clearing debris near the perimeter, a task permitted by the camp rules, she worked slowly, carefully, using a stick and a piece of dark charcoal she had found. She smoothed a small patch of dirt until it was level and compacted. The subtle conflict was the shift in Miller's demeanor. He seemed to sense her intention, no longer reading his magazine with total absorption. He became still, his posture reverting to that of a vigilant guard, yet his eyes betrayed a certain curiosity, fixed on her deliberate movements. Akemi took a deep breath, fighting the sudden urge to tremble. She etched a single familiar kanji character into the smooth earth, the character for I, home, or possibly heiwa, peace. It was a simple, profound message, stripped of national allegiance, a universal expression of yearning that defied the military-political conflict. This quiet, desperate act was the turning point. Miller saw the character. He did not immediately call his superior or issue a warning. He simply stopped patrolling his short beat and stood directly opposite her, his silhouette framed against the fading afternoon light. A faint scent of his cigarette smoke drifted over, another small reminder of his life beyond the wire. His face remained neutral, his gaze intense. He looked at the character for a long, silent minute, absorbing the weight of the inscription, a statement of existence and desire from the enemy. Finally, without breaking his disciplined posture or moving a foot closer to the fence, Miller gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. It was neither a friendly gesture nor a violation of the no-contact rule. It was a simple, wordless acknowledgement of the message, and thus of the person who created it. He did not erase it, nor did he allow himself to speak to her. Akemi's heart, which had been tight with fear and shame, felt a sudden, surprising release. The gesture confirmed that the humanity she had observed in the American routines, the clean boots, the disciplined reading of the magazine, the Sunday hymns, was not purely systemic, but also rooted in the individual. He saw her loss, her yearning for home, and he acknowledged it. The exchange was complete. The silent question answered by a silent, cautious affirmation. The shift from enemy to human was now mutual, albeit tenuous. The order for transfer came suddenly, disrupting the fragile, negotiated calm of the Tinian camp. Akemi, Haruko, and the other women were told they would be moving to a larger, more permanent facility for the duration, Camp Alice, on the island of Oahu, in the territory of Hawaii. The news brought a mix of apprehension and relief. The constant, tense observation of the fence line would end, but the uncertainty of a new place, a new set of guards, loomed large. The women were issued new, clean clothes and thick, surprisingly soft blankets for the journey. The tactile experience of the soft, new fabric against her skin was another subtle form of the enemy's soft power, the ability to provide comfort as effortlessly as they had waged war. Akemi helped Haruko fold hers neatly. As they were loaded onto the back of a canvas-covered army truck, the smell of diesel fuel heavy in the air, Akemi made sure she was one of the last to climb aboard. She paused, taking a final look at the small makeshift camp that had witnessed the dramatic collapse of her worldview. Her eyes drifted naturally to Private Miller's post. He wasn't there. His shift must have ended. But on the top of the supply crate where he always sat, someone, perhaps Miller, perhaps his relief, had left something. It was a brand new magazine, its cover a fresh, startling splash of primary colors, untouched by the humidity or the sun. It was an intentional repetition of the shock object, confirming the enemy's endless supply and casual use of cultural luxury. The sight was the final turning point. Akemi no longer felt shame or envy, but a calm, focused curiosity. The magazine was not a mockery. It was the reality of the world she was now entering, a world she would have to navigate through understanding, not resistance. The truck lurched forward, starting the long, noisy ride toward the harbor. Akemi looked down at the soft blanket draped over her shoulder, then forward into the unknown distance. The transition was complete. Her gaze was no longer that of a fearful captive, but of a survivor ready to learn. The journey was long, ending weeks later when the prisoners were led from a smaller vessel onto the docks of Oahu. The air here was different, cooler, smelling of flowers and distant civilization. The sounds of American city life filtering faintly into the security perimeter. Akemi stepped out, shielding Haruko as the camp gate was being opened. A new American guard, a private first class with eyes just as steady as Miller's, sat on an upturned crate, his rifle resting on his knees. He was again reading a brightly colored magazine. "Do not look at the sun, Miss Akemi. It will blind you," the guard said, his voice quiet but clear. His tone was not a threat, but a flat warning, a perfect echo of the first encounter. Yet now Akemi heard not fear, but the strange sound of a routine of safety. This place, Camp Alice, was where her education in the nature of the enemy's soft power would truly begin.